2,000 people, 62 miles from Baku, and more than 100 miles of paved road, not 1 inch of which touches land. Right now, a truck is driving along one of those roads. It is a narrow strip of asphalt and steel, wide enough for a single vehicle, held about 6 meters above the water on thin, rusting legs. On both sides of the driver, there is no barrier and no shoulder. There is the edge of the road, and then there is the Caspian Sea, and the seabed is a long way down. He is not lost. He is going to work. In about 4 minutes, he will arrive at a 9-story apartment block standing in open water, park outside it, and walk in past a bakery. This place has a hospital. It has a football pitch. It has a park with real trees, growing in soil that had to be carried out here by ship, because there is no soil. There is no ground at all. Every square meter of this settlement is standing on steel driven into the seabed, and underneath some of it there are ships. It is called Neft Daşları. In English, oil rocks. It was built in 1949, and it was the first offshore oil city in the world. And here is the part that surprises people. It is still working, not preserved, not fenced off as a museum. 2,000 people rotate through it on a 15-day cycle, right now pumping oil out of a field that was opened before the first commercial jet ever flew. There are 3 things going on out there. The first is the reason it exists at all. Because building a city in the middle of a sea is an absurd solution to an oil problem, and the Soviets had a very specific reason for choosing it. The second is what the place is physically made of. And there is one thing about its foundations that almost nobody outside Azerbaijan knows, and once you hear it, you will not be able to look at a photograph of it the same way again. And the third is the reason it is still running today, when the numbers say it should have been shut down decades ago. That one is not what you would guess. So let us start with the obvious question. Why build a city instead of just going back to shore each night? Because in 1949, nothing else worked. But before the engineering, you need the pressure, because nobody builds something this strange unless they are desperate. Azerbaijan had been an oil country for a very long time. Oil seeps around Baku were being written about centuries ago, and Marco Polo described them. Serious industrial drilling came in the 19th century, and by the First World War, the region produced around 175 million barrels. By 1941, Azerbaijan was supplying roughly 75% of the entire Soviet Union's oil. Then the war ended. The onshore fields around Baku had been worked hard for decades, and the Soviet state needed to know what was under the water. Between the mid and late 1940s, geologists ran systematic surveys of the Caspian Shelf. Sailors had reported black rocks in one particular area, slicked with a film of oil rising from the seabed, and that stretch of water had been noticed as far back as 1859. The surveys confirmed it. There was a large field down there. Then came the practical problem. How do you produce oil 40-odd kilometers out at sea with 1949 technology? There were no helicopters ferrying crews back and forth. There were no dynamic positioning systems, no floating production vessels, no modern supply chain. The only way to reach that spot was by boat, and a boat crossing takes hours in good weather and does not run at all in bad. So the answer they arrived at was not a platform. It was a town. Think about what the alternative would have required. A crew works a shift and then has to be taken off. That means a vessel on standby at all times in a sea that produces storms severe enough to make a crossing impossible for days at a stretch. It means that if the weather closes in on a Tuesday, your entire workforce is either stuck on a structure with nowhere to sleep or stuck on shore while the wells sit idle. Neither is acceptable when a state has decided this field is a national priority. If the workers cannot reliably leave, then everything the workers need has to be out there with them. Beds, food, water, power. A doctor, because a man with appendicitis is 4 hours from a hospital in good conditions and considerably further in bad ones. And once you have committed to that, you are no longer building an oil rig. You are building a municipality on stilts, and it will need a bakery. There is something worth noticing in that decision. Modern offshore engineering solved this problem in the opposite direction. It made the crossing fast with helicopters so the structure could stay small. The Soviets could not make the crossing fast, so they made the structure enormous. Two entirely different answers to the same question, separated by about 20 years of technology. On the 7th of November 1949, a crew drilled the first exploratory well at that spot down to 942 meters, and it came in at about 100 tons of oil a day. That date is the reason Neft Daşları holds a place in the Guinness World Records as the oldest offshore oil platform in the world. In 1951, the first tanker of oil went back to shore and serious construction began. What they built over the following decades is genuinely difficult to picture, which brings us to the structure itself. The settlement is not one platform. It is an artificial archipelago. Depending on which count you use, somewhere between 200 and 300 separate production platforms, drilling rigs and building sites, spread across open sea and stitched together by a web of trestle bridges and causeways. At its peak, that road network ran to around 200 kilometers. Some counts put it considerably higher. Today, well over 100 miles of it is still standing, and the rest has gone into the water. 200 kilometers of road is worth sitting with for a second because it is not a figure that belongs to a workplace. It is the figure of a small country's road system. You could drive for 2 hours out there without repeating a stretch, and at no point would you be on land. The roads have junctions. They have names. They were built to be driven on by ordinary trucks doing ordinary errands, and they were laid on landfill and steel piling over open water because there was no other surface to put them on. On those platforms, they built something designed to be lived in rather than merely worked on. Apartment blocks up to 9 stories high. A 5-story dormitory added in the late 1970s. A power plant, shops, a cinema, a library, a cultural center with a theater, a school, a hospital, a tea house, a canteen, a mosque, a water treatment plant, a waste incinerator, a football pitch, and a park. Actual trees in actual soil brought out by ship and spread across a steel platform in the middle of the Caspian Sea so that men working a shift 40 kilometers from the nearest coastline could sit under something green. At its height in the 1960s, more than 5,000 people were out there. There is one detail about that era that changes how you picture the whole thing. Families stayed on shore. This was never a town with children in it. It was a town of workers, rotating, with their lives waiting somewhere else, and the school and the cinema and the park existed to make a 15-day absence bearable rather than to raise a generation. So what does it actually take to get there? And what happens when you arrive? There is still no bridge to land, and there never was. The crossing is by sea, and on a modern ferry it runs to about 2.5 hours. For most of that time there is nothing on the horizon but the outlines of other rigs, and Baku shrinking behind you into haze. Then the shapes resolve, and what you are looking at is not a platform. It is a skyline. Once you are on it, the ordinary problems of a town start arriving in an unusual order. There is no aquifer under a steel platform, so fresh water is a supply chain and a treatment plant, not a tap. Waste cannot simply be taken away by a truck at the end of the week, which is why there is an incinerator on site. Power has to be generated where it is used. Every service that a normal municipality receives from the land around it, this place has to manufacture inside its own footprint. And then, on top of that, it has to feel like somewhere a person can spend 2 weeks. That is what the tea house is for, and the canteen, and the football pitch, and the mosque, and the theater. None of those things extract a single barrel of oil. They exist because the engineers understood something that a lot of industrial projects have learned the hard way since. If you are going to keep people somewhere they cannot leave, the hardest problem is not the drilling, it is the evenings. And the geography of the settlement makes that harder than it sounds. On a conventional platform, everything is within a few dozen meters of everything else. Here, the accommodation, the production platforms, the workshops, and the services are spread across an archipelago connected by those roads. Getting from where you sleep to where you work can be a drive, which means the settlement has something almost no other offshore installation on Earth has, and it is oddly ordinary. It has a commute. But now we get to the thing I promised you, the detail about the foundations. They sank ships, not as scrap, as building material. When the engineers needed a solid base to build on in open water in 1949, without modern piling equipment for large structures, they took old vessels, towed them into position, and deliberately scuttled them onto the seabed. Those hulls became the artificial islands. The platforms, the roads, and eventually the apartment blocks were built on top of them. Reports vary on how many, but the most striking part is not the number. It is one specific ship. Among the vessels used as foundations was the Zoroaster. The Zoroaster was Swedish-built and is widely regarded as the first purpose-built oil tanker in history. The vessel that helped invent the modern movement of oil by sea was sunk on purpose and used as a footing for the world's first offshore oil city. It is still down there, somewhere under the concrete and the steel and the paved streets, holding part of it up. I am curious what you would find strangest about all of that. The trees, the football pitch, the ships underneath, or the road with no barrier. And that raises a question about the people themselves. Who works out there now? Not a population. A workforce, and a fairly rigid one. The site runs under SOCAR, the Azerbaijani state oil company, with extraction crews, technical support staff, and administrative personnel layered in a clear hierarchy, because an isolated site with 2,000 people on it does not tolerate ambiguity about who decides things. There are no permanent residents. Everyone is on rotation, and the standard pattern today is 15 days on the water. It is predominantly men, though not exclusively, and the families are all ashore, mostly in Baku. What people who have spent time there describe is the thing every isolated site produces eventually. A shared, slightly closed culture that forms out of the simple fact that the same faces are the only faces for 2 weeks. Camaraderie is the word that comes up, and it comes up alongside a second observation that is less romantic. One former worker described watching colleagues push through sleet on the walkways without complaint and realizing how wide the gap was between an ordinary employee and the people who had genuinely made this place their working life. That is a fair description of what the job asks. Not heroism, persistence, in weather, on steel, a long way from anything. Because the question that hangs over Neft Daşları now is what happens to a city built for an oil field that is running out. The production numbers tell that story better than anything. Over roughly 75 years, the field has produced close to 180 million tons of oil, according to SOCAR. Its record year was 1967, when it pushed out 7.6 million tons. Today, it produces under 3,000 tons a day. That is somewhere around 1 million tons a year. Against a peak year of 7.6 million, the field is running at a fraction of what it once did, and estimates of what is still recoverable sit at roughly 30 million tons. And the structure has been aging the entire time. Large sections of the causeway network are closed off. Roads that used to carry trucks now stop at the edge of open water where the next span has gone. Steel that has stood in salt water since the 1950s does what steel does in salt water. Around some of the older worker dormitories, the sea has risen high enough against the buildings that the waterline reaches the second-floor windows. There have been environmental consequences, too, and they are not disputed. Local campaigners have raised untreated wastewater and oil discharge into the Caspian, and SOCAR has said it has run a substantial program over the past 20 years to stop pollution from the old wells, and that closed systems now handle the fluids from production. And the sea itself is changing underneath the whole thing. The Caspian is shrinking, and its level has been falling. For a structure whose entire design assumes a fixed relationship between the platforms and the water, a moving sea level is not a background detail. It is a slow structural problem arriving on a timescale nobody planned for in 1949. In the gardens near the center, there are monuments to workers who did not come home. Industrial accidents, storms. The Caspian is not a gentle sea, and a city standing 6 meters above it on legs has an unforgiving relationship with weather. So the population fell. 5,000 became 2,000. The families were already ashore. What is left is a working core surrounded by an enormous rusting outer ring that nobody is repairing. Which raises the obvious question. If the field is nearly finished and the structure is falling apart, why is anyone still out there? Now, here is what surprises people. Ask what Neft Daşları is for today, and the honest answer is not really oil anymore. It is something closer to refusing to let the first one die. The economics on their own are thin. 1 million tons a year from a field that needs constant maintenance on infrastructure that has been sitting in seawater for over 70 years is not the kind of asset anyone would build now. Azerbaijan has far larger and far newer offshore developments. And yet, SOCAR describes it as an active asset with a unique role and keeps 2,000 people cycling through it. Part of that is straightforward. The pay is good, rates are substantially better for workers who stay on site, and a 15-day rotation with a solid wage is a real living in a way that is worth the crossing. Part of it is that the field genuinely does still produce, and 30 million recoverable tons is not nothing. A field that has already given up 180 million tons and still has that much left is not a museum piece, whatever the state of the walkways above it. But the part that people who have been out there keep returning to is harder to put on a balance sheet. This is the first one. Every offshore platform anywhere in the world, every rig in the North Sea and the Gulf of Mexico and off the coast of Brazil descends from an idea that was tested here in 1949 by people who did not know whether it would work. And there is open talk now about what comes after the oil. Guides on the site have raised the possibility that it becomes a destination rather than a workplace. The first offshore oil city, preserved as the thing it actually is, which is a monument, which means the men out there today are doing 2 jobs at once. They are producing oil, and they are keeping a 77-year-old experiment standing long enough for somebody to decide what it is worth. So the next time you see a photograph of that place, spires of rusting steel rising out of flat blue water, do not picture an abandoned ruin that somebody forgot to demolish. Picture a truck on a road with no barrier 6 meters above the Caspian, driving out to a 9-story building with a bakery in it. Picture the trees somebody carried out here by ship. And picture the first oil tanker ever built, lying on the seabed underneath all of it, still holding up the road. It is falling into the sea, and it is still open for business. Both of those things are true at once. That is oil rocks. Could you drive that road every day? Yes or no? Drop it in the comments. And if you have worked offshore in the Caspian or anywhere the infrastructure is older than you are, tell us what we got right and what we missed. I read all of them. If you got something out of this, subscribe. There is a lot more of this world to go through.